Hey, everybody. In this podcast, I want to talk pretty briefly about what Grant was up to about the same time that Sherman was marching through Georgia. Remember, this campaign begins in late April or May 1864. Again, to remind you what I've said numerous times, it's a simultaneous campaign. Sherman's going against the Confederate Army under Joseph Johnson in Georgia. And Grant is going after Lee's army in Northern Virginia. Uh, Now, as I said in the previous podcast, what was a little bit complicated about the command structure for the Army of the Potomac in Virginia was that the officer in direct command of the Union Army in this area was George Gordon Meade, the victor of Gettysburg. But his boss was U.S. Grant. By March of 1864, Grant has been given command of all the Union armies all over the United States, and he's given an officer rank that had only been held by George Washington. So his charge is very, very clear. So Grant sticks pretty closely to Meade. So Meade has operational control of his army, but he has his boss looking over his shoulder for all of the campaign, what we call the Overland Campaign, through Northern Virginia. So it works pretty well. Meade is basically Grant's subordinate, but it's a little bit of an awkward setup. So Grant's plan is he wants to grind down Lee's army. He wants to see if he can get Lee's army in the open field in Northern Virginia, and if he can annihilate it. This was the hope anyway. Lee's much too smart, and he's much too clever a tactician. And he's also gets lucky sometimes. And one of Grant's problems was a problem that was always facing the Union Army of the Potomac. His officer corps was very mixed. Grant's officers were not the best. They were unfamiliar with him. They had kind of, you might say, defeat kind of bred into them because of all the troubles they'd had up until March of 1864, with the exception, I guess, of Gettysburg. The Union Army, the common soldier, they had a great deal of respect for Grant. There's a very famous story where Grant is sitting on top of a railroad car eating some chicken, and some soldiers start cheering him, and he just kind of waves a chicken leg at them, very low key. One soldier said, we knew that the boss had arrived once Grant got there. So the common soldiers pick up pretty quickly that Grant's somebody that knows what he's doing, but he is plagued by a very mixed record among his lower officers. So he's starting near the Rapidan River, just a little bit south and east of Washington, D.C., where Lee's army is. And he goes towards Lee's army, trying to capture them in the field and, like I said before, annihilate Lee's army. It never happens the way Grant really wants it to happen. Lee is able to position his troops in such a way that he never is forced to face annihilation, at least at this initial stage of the campaign. Now, I'm not going to go into the 40-day campaign of the Overland Campaign. There's a number of very, very famous and very, very horrific battles that occurred during this campaign. The Wilderness Courthouse, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. It's just a very, very bloody, completely unromantic aspect of the Civil War. Nothing pretty about it. It's just basically armies grinding against one another. Grant either trying to destroy Lee or get behind him. Lee fighting quite brilliantly defensive battles. In about a 40-day period, Grant takes 55,000 casualties in a 40-day period, and he had about 120,000 men. Lee takes 33,000 casualties, and don't get too obsessed about these figures. So he takes fewer casualties than Grant. But the problem is that Lee only had about 65,000 men. So total when the Wilderness Campaign or the Overland Campaign of Grant started. So he doesn't suffer the same in sheer numbers, but in proportion, he loses a larger proportion of his army than does Grant, because Grant's army is so much larger. And then never forget that Grant has a much more of a capacity to pull out Union troops from the population of the North, because the North is probably 3 times larger than the South in terms of population. So what happens is, in brief, there's a number of battles. The first battle is the Battle of the Wilderness. Grant's Union Army crosses and faces Lee. Lee fights Grant to a standstill at the Battle of the Wilderness. And we have a turning point of the Civil War at the Battle of the Wilderness. Every time that Lee had fought a Union army to a standstill, the Union Army had always retreated. It had always gone back into the North. This happens at Bull Run. This happens at both Bull Runs. It happens after the Battle of Chancellorsville. This was just the way the Union Army operated. It would cross a river into Virginia. It would face Lee. Lee would fight the Union Army to a standstill and defeat it in most cases, and then the Union Army would retreat. What happens with Grant's very different. Grant is fought to a standstill at the Battle of the Wilderness by Robert E. Lee, but in a key moment of the Civil War, he keeps pressing Lee. He keeps pressing Lee back towards Richmond. And again, I've said this a bunch of times, don't get too obsessed with Richmond. It's not necessarily that Grant is going after Richmond. It's just that Lee's army is between Grant and Richmond. What Grant is going after is Lee's army, and Lee's army is protecting Richmond. So that's how this plays out. So Union soldiers, it's a very famous incident among Civil War historians. After the Battle of the Wilderness, which happened in early May of 1864, where Grant had been fought to a standstill, Union soldiers fully expected to retreat and to go back across the Rapidan River, go regroup around Washington, D.C., and try once again. And they were amazed and they were ecstatic when actually Grant, instead of heading north, he continues to head south. He continues to grind away at Robert E. Lee. And this is the story of the Overland Campaign. Again, there are a number of individual battles in this 40-day campaign, but the big picture here, and this is where I'm at the point in the semester, I don't want to go too much into the details of the battle. You can read about that in the Catton book, and for you Civil War folks, you'll be reading about this maybe for the rest of your lives. But that's fine. I do the same thing. So the big picture here is this, is that Grant is just pushing Lee back towards Richmond. But again, it's not necessarily he's trying to capture Richmond. He's just trying to kill as many of Lee's soldiers as he can. Now, Lee, for his part, does not go on the offensive. He knows he can't invade the North again. Those days are gone after Gettysburg. But Lee's thinking is that if he can kill a number of Grant's soldiers, and he kills 55,000, or actually he kills and wounds 55,000 Grant soldiers in a 40-day period. So we're talking about over 1,000 Union soldiers a day are being killed and wounded in May and the first part of June of 1864. Just incredible if you think about it. It's a real meat grinder. That Northern morale will collapse, and that Lincoln will lose the election, that he won't be reelected in 1864, and a different candidate will come in, a different president will come in, McClellan, as we know, who will make peace with the South and probably let the South go on its merry way. So Grant does not make the progress that he expects or Lincoln expects initially. It just turns out that Lee is just too good a tactician to allow Grant to trap Lee's army in an open field and annihilate it. And so what you start having is a war of movement, of maneuver, as Grant keeps trying to go around Lee towards Richmond to kind of get behind Lee's army. And Lee is always able to, just at the nick of time, get in front of Grant's army. And then there's battles. Here's the big picture, though. I know that was probably confusing the way I just said it. Lee just grinds down Grant just grinds down Lee from northern Virginia all the way down the middle of Virginia to a little town called Petersburg in a 40-day period. And Petersburg is significant because it's the front door to Richmond. If Grant can take Petersburg, it's a rail center, then he's going to take Richmond. And so what happens in these 40 days is that Grant moves down Virginia, the Virginia coast, and he's never able to destroy Lee's army. But by the end of the 40 days, Grant has laid siege to Lee's army outside of Petersburg, Virginia, which is a small railroad town a little bit east of Richmond. So, long story short, what you have after the Overland Campaign and these 55,000 casualties is from June of 1864 until April of 1865, Grant is laying siege to Petersburg. Grant has successfully trapped Robert E. Lee. Now, Lee, in a tactical sense, is the winner because he stops Grant from destroying his army. But Grant, in the larger strategic sense, has got what he wants. He's trapped Lee's army around Petersburg. Lee's army cannot do any damage. Lee's army cannot, for instance, it can't send any troops to fight against Sherman, which is something that it might have done before because, of course, Grant is putting maximum pressure on Lee's army. So one of the big picture thing, and one of the ways you might want to think about it, is after the Overland Campaign is done in June of 1864, Lee now is laying siege to Petersburg, which means laying siege to Richmond. He's trapped Lee's army in these defensive position around Petersburg. And he basically what this does is this is what allows Sherman to do what he does in Georgia, because the Confederate army in Georgia cannot be reinforced by Lee's forces because Lee needs every man he has because Grant is putting maximum pressure on him. So again, for sophisticated Civil War historians, what you need to realize is that even though on the face of it, it doesn't look like the Union armies are acting in a coordinated fashion, they certainly are. They're acting under a plan that a strategic vision that Grant had created. He had hoped to be able to destroy Lee's army quickly, but Lee proved too good a general for that. But he's pinned up Lee's army outside of Richmond. He's basically trapped them in a siege, which lasts something like 10 months. Lee is not able to reinforce Sherman, and so Sherman can do what he does in Atlanta and then up through the Carolinas with pretty much impunity because Lee can't reinforce. He can't send any troops to fight Sherman because he needs every man he can to face against Grant.